Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents A Brief History of Japan, Samurai, Shogun and Zen, The Extraordinary Story of the Land of the Rising Sun, by Jonathan Clements, narrated by Julian. Preface. The first time I arrived in Japan, I was more prepared than most newcomers. I had been studying in Taiwan and could already understand all the signs on the street, even if I could not necessarily pronounce them. Quite by accident, I was arriving not in the Tokyo region, but in Japan's ancient heartland of Kyoto, which would soon bewitch me with its history and culture. I was there to study pre-modern Japanese foreign relations and Japanese literature. I shopped like it was going out of fashion, shipping home box after box of books and CDs, VHS cassettes, and shogi boards. I had been studying Japanese for several months and was sure that one day it would all fall into place. 25 years and 3 degrees later, I still felt very much like a beginner. On my most recent trip to Japan, I was old enough to be the father of the student I once was. I hardly bought a thing, knowing that online stores would ship anything I wanted to my homeland at the touch of a button. Instead, I poked around obscure museums in search of locally published histories and unchronicled folklore. I trudged across ancient battlefields to understand the meaning of old war poems. I watched my son as he played, alone in a well-appointed, impeccably clean playground. I counted the second-hand stores that had sprung up in Kyoto's Teramachi shopping district, and marveled that it was easier to buy diapers for adults than for children. I dropped in on friends in Nagoya whose young son was taking part in a dragon dance, although there were so few children in the neighborhood that their dragon looked more like a crocodile. I was now an author, the biographer of several figures in Japanese history, Prince Saionji and Admiral Togo, the teenage rebel Amakusa Shiro, and the pirate king Koxinga. My speciality had always been the snatching of weird and wonderful stories and their popularization for a general audience. What could be more weird and wonderful than the story of an entire nation, from its mythical beginnings to its near future? The toughest decision facing the author of a book like this is what to leave out. Tim Hannigan's Trailblazing, A Brief History of Indonesia, has set the tone and attitude for this series, and I have followed his template as closely as possible. Like him, I must face the impossibility of a story that spans millions of years with a cast of thousands somehow hitting the high points without dumbing down or talking up. Many before me have tried to tell the story of Japan in such a manner. Many have been defeated by the discipline of history itself, the ready temptation to cavil and kvetch about any definitive statement. How feudal was the feudal period? How closed was the Sakoku era? Whom to mention, whom to discard? Which of the 125 emperors is worth including? Which of the dozens of shoguns? And should I put an S on the end of shogun? Who will make the cut from Japanese writers and artists, philosophers and samurai? When others have written entire books about the subjects of single pages, even single lines, the task is daunting. I thought back to the person I was before I arrived in Japan, before I even started learning Japanese. What would he want to know? What stories would he have first wanted to hear? What would have first fired him up to learn more about this incredible, endlessly surprising country? And should things be set out so that it isn't a confusing jumble of multisyllabic names? Unlike, say, China, where history can be broken up into discrete dynasties, there is only one dynasty in Japan, and it claims to have ruled the nation since the dawn of history. Some quibble with this, and it is likely that scholars in the near future may start to reimagine the single imperial line as several linked pockets of relation and influence, such as Hermann Ohm's recent suggestion that 8th century Japan was ruled by a Temnu dynasty. In the meantime, historians and educators are obliged to find another way of breaking up Japanese history. They usually plump for some sort of system that notes who was really in charge. You won't be far into this book before you realize what a wild goose chase this is, since power in Japan is all too often a matter of shifting consensus and implied needs. Samurai would go to war over what the wishes of their chosen candidate for emperor would be if they were successful in putting him on the throne. Shogunal regents agreed what their infant charge would probably want, if only he could speak. In this book I have concentrated on specific moments of transformation, the settlement of Japan itself and the arrival of a new wave of emigrants from the Asian continent. Later chapters deal with several crucial periods of foreign contact and the aftermath of each, the arrival of Chinese culture and Buddhism, and then the period in which Japan forged on without such foreign contacts, the arrival of early Christian missionaries, and the brutal 200-year seclusion that followed their expulsion, the arrival of colonial powers in the 19th century, with the revolutionary changes they introduced to Japanese society, followed by Japan's troubled, martial entry into the modern world, and finally the immense and far-reaching impact of the US occupation from 1945 to 1952, which left Japan changed once more. On each occasion, Japan is flooded by foreign culture and ideas, seems at first to ape them, but then adapts and transforms them into something original. I almost use the word unique there, but the myth of Japanese uniqueness, Nihon Jinron, is itself a controversial topic. Meanwhile, the historian of Japan has to contend with a counterintuitive and unexpected development in recent years. The older Japanese history is, the more new discoveries there seem to have been. The general listener might be forgiven for thinking that Japan's ancient history is fixed and immobile, but so much has happened in the field in the last generation that the distant past often seems vibrant and alive. In part, this is because of the incredible effect that late 20th century Japan's surging economy had on the building trade. New towns sprang up in places like Tokyo's Tama Hills suburb, leading to a number of accidental archaeological finds, as well as races against time to gather information before it was smothered by a car park or shopping mall. The expense of such rescue archaeology in Japan multiplied tenfold between 1970 and 1977, and tenfold again by 1992. It reached a plateau thereafter as Japan's ballooning economy deflated once more, but the effects on archaeology reverberated for another decade as scholars pored over their new data. For years afterward, Japanese archaeology saw incredible finds and game-changing new theories, challenging much of the previous wisdom and leaving many earlier history books outdated and irrelevant. Politics remains a powerful influence on Japanese history. When it comes to ancient times, the big problem comes from the reality gap between a national mythology that claims the emperors are all descended from the sun goddess and archaeology that suggests that they are descended from Korean aristocrats. Although the prominent nobleman Tokugawa Mitsukuni did dig up an old tomb in 1692, he swiftly put back whatever it was he found. All deliberate excavation of tombs was declared illegal in Japan in 1874, and although conditions thawed in the 20th century, the imperial household has long been obstructive regarding the excavation of grave mounds that are likely to contain the ancestors of the current emperor. In 1976, amid a popular publishing boom obsessed with Japan's prehistoric past, archaeologists were forbidden once more from opening imperial graves. Some of these sites undoubtedly were robbed long ago, but there is no telling what historical riches await in some of the great tombs that lie unexamined in Japan. The first chapter of this book, Prehistoric and Mythical Japan, is hence separated from the second by a wall of legends, because there is still no means of accurately examining the period before 700 CE. Imagine for a moment how different our understanding of China would be without the materials unearthed since 1970 in Chinese grave sites. We would know nothing of the first emperor's terracotta army, nothing of the legal statutes of the Qin or the unexpurgated Dao De Jing, nothing of the military textbooks of Sun Bin. Apologists might just as readily praise the Japanese for remaining so in touch with their roots and so respectful of their traditions that they do not authorize the ransacking of old tombs. But at the moment, Japan's imperial graves remain closed to archaeology, and that drastically reduces the chances of ever uncovering a Japanese manuscript that predates the 700s. I find it particularly frustrating because, for me, the most interesting element of early Japanese history lies in its early connections with Korean states such as Kara and Baekje. Korean exiles provided entire branches and houses of what would become the Japanese nobility, regarded as close enough relatives that their native ranks would transfer across to Japan. Contacts with Japan are frequently mentioned in the Korean Baekje annals until 428 CE, when all mention of the country is dropped for the next 2 centuries, an omission that has yet to be satisfactorily explained. But more recent history, particularly the early 20th century, has so politicized the discussion of Korean-Japanese contacts that academics are put off by its toxicity. In 2008, a hand-picked group of scholars was allowed to enter the giant Gosashi grave mound, rumoured to be the resting place of the legendary Empress Jingu, for a grand total of 150 minutes. The investigators were not allowed to touch anything and were swiftly shooed out again. A stiffly worded fax to National Geographic reminded the scientific community that in Japan, such sites were not part of a forgotten ancient culture, but directly linked to the incumbent head of state. It read, "Imperial household religious ceremonies continue to take place at tombs and mausolea. As they are objects of remembrance and veneration for the public and imperial family, preserving their peace and dignity is of paramount importance." The current emperor, known abroad as Akihito, more properly as Emperor Heisei by the policy I use in this book, has muddied the waters a bit by acknowledging some of his Korean ancestors, but only several dozen generations down the family tree, allowing for the possibility that his other forefathers were still superpowered beings who descended from space. Meanwhile, the Koreans can be defensively nationalist about their relationship with Japan. Kara, or Kaya, or Gaia, or Imna, was a Dark Age state in the southern Korean peninsula that probably provided ancient Japan with many of its introductions to mainland culture. The word kara endured in Japanese as a term for the mainland, as in the word karate, which originally meant Chinese hand, but the state was referred to in Japanese as mimana. However, since that name only turns up amid ancient Japanese claims of having conquered it, one uses that proper noun in the presence of Korean historians at one's peril. Early in the 21st century, a Korean academy tried to establish some sort of common ground on cross-straits archaeology from the contentious 4th century CE, but their Japanese counterparts refused to cooperate on a joint statement. Japan's ancient history remains, at least in part, a matter of religious belief that brooks no tampering. Although this is not intended as an academic book, I have done my best to reflect trends in modern scholarship, which include history as viewed through changes to the climate and environment. There have been impressive developments in the last generation in such concepts as the invention of tradition, the eco-history of Japan, and some remarkably original uses of what we now call big data. My favourite remains the group of boffins who extrapolated medieval climate conditions by tabulating the varying dates of annual cherry blossom parties. Scholars have also learned much in recent years by investigating previously marginalised groups such as women and the underclass, as well as groups on the Japanese periphery. I note here, for example, that the oldest human remains anywhere in the Japanese archipelago, from circa 30,000 BCE, were found in the Ryukyu Islands, while the culture of the Ainu in Hokkaido may offer us the merest glimpse of the way of life of Japan's indigenous inhabitants. Point of departure: Chipangu. China, 1280 CE. Marco Polo saw it with his own eyes. The river Yangtze was thick with ships great and small, ocean-going traders, robust war junks, and huge numbers of shakily repurposed riverboats. All were being readied for the latest great enterprise of the new emperor, the Mongol Kublai Khan. A massive armada that would cross the sea to annihilate the defiant island kingdom of Chipangu. Nobody in the West had ever heard of this Chipangu before. Marco Polo's account was the first to even mention it in a European language. When he did, he drew on years of propaganda designed to fire up the conscripts of Kublai's navy, as well as lies and spin concocted by reluctant Korean allies. In his intimidating correspondence with the rulers of Chipangu, Kublai had belittled the nation as a jumped-up barbaric kingdom, uncomprehending of courtly etiquette and ignorant of the trouble it would be in if it did not submit to him. However, in his exhortations to his armies, he made sure that everybody knew how incredibly rich Chipangu was. They have enthused Marco Polo, on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, gold in abundance, because it is found there in measureless quantities. Kublai Khan had already made one attempt to invade the island kingdom after a decade of increasingly antagonistic diplomatic exchanges. Not only the people of Chipangu, but also their Korean counterparts, had literally spent years lying about the distance to the islands and the likelihood of strong resistance. Embassies had been fobbed off with numerous wily excuses and often failed to work out whom they were supposed to be addressing. The natives infamously claimed to have an emperor of equal standing to the ruler of China, but the man who sat on their throne in 1274 was only a figurehead. His father, the former emperor, had abdicated, allowing him to meddle in politics from behind the scenes. His mother supposedly had no power of her own, but was a member of the powerful Fujiwara family, obliging the new emperor to listen to the wishes of his grandfather and uncles. His wife, meanwhile, was a scion of the Minamoto family, another powerful clan with vested interests. And yet none of this really mattered, because foreign policy and many local issues were in the hands of the emperor's barbarian-suppressing supreme general, the shogun, in the town of Kamakura. But the shogun was himself a puppet of yet another group, the Hojo clan that had secretly run the islands for many decades. His own job was delegated to a regent, the shiken, who at the time was a callow youth of 23, leaning on a shadowy council of advisers. Your guess is as good as mine, and certainly as good as Kublai's, as to who was really in charge. Such obfuscations were not unique to Cipangu. The Mongols were getting a similar runaround far to the south in what is now Vietnam, where any request for a direct answer would be passed around a series of grandly titled bigwigs, any one of whom might waste another couple of months by sending back a request for clarification. The land that Marco Polo knew as Cipangu was impossible to understand beyond a distant horizon, itself at the very edge of the known Asian world and apparently controlled by a nebulous, invisible hegemony of power brokers and alliances. This would not be the last time it was described in such terms. Still, at least Kublai could mention all that imaginary gold. His troops were drunk on stories of it. The armies that had pushed Mongol rule all over Asia were ready to advance on these unknown islands, hoping thereby to shut down so-called pirate bases. What happened next is one of the greatest war stories of human history. Kublai's first armada in 1274 swiftly snatched the islands of Tsushima and Iki in the 200-kilometre, 124-mile strait. The huge fleet packed into the wide sweep of Hakata Bay, which had been for centuries the gateway to the islands for any foreign shipping. The natives were waiting for them. The country had not seen a meaningful battle for 2 generations, and the members of its warrior class, the samurai, were spoiling for a fight. They had, however, distinctly odd ideas about how a battle should proceed. The Mongols and their Korean and Chinese allies watched in bafflement as a soldier clad in strange armour, tied with brightly coloured silks, shot a noise-making, humming bulb arrow over their heads. It screamed in the air on the blustery November day, intended by the defenders to signal a parley and a series of small bouts between champions. The Mongols retaliated with a volley of deadly poison arrows. They were not there to take part in some local battle ceremony. They were there to invade. The fighting that broke out was so fierce that it cost the defenders a third of their military manpower by the end of the first day. The Mongols, however, had no way of seeing over the wall. Unsure of their ability to hold a beachhead that was all but encircled by enemy fortifications, they retreated back to their ships to await the dawn. The natives had other plans, taking to the waters in a swarm of little boats piled high with kindling. They crept aboard the enemy ships, starting fires and knifing sailors, although many of the flames were soon put out by heavy rain. Soon the wind whipped up even further. The natives pulled back, looking on as the elements carried on the fight for them. The mother of all storms pounded down on the armada, overturning smaller boats and threatening to bash the close-packed ships into each other. Captains ordered their crews to push their vessels into deeper waters where the swell would not be so dangerous. But it was too late. The storm had escalated into a monstrous typhoon that dashed the invaders against the coastline and into each other, swamping them and overturning them, crushing troop transports and supply vessels. It was soon too dark to see, but the defenders on land heard the powerful crack of timbers and the screams of men and horses. The following morning, as the sun parted the clouds, Hakata Bay was carpeted in driftwood. A handful of soaked survivors washed ashore at several points along the coastline, where they were swiftly put to death. A few of the larger Chinese ships made it out and ran straight for home. A year later, a new embassy arrived from Kublai, presenting the Shiken region with a golden scroll that offered to make him the king of Cipangu. It was a gesture of reconciliation, suggesting that everybody could spare themselves further trouble if the natives just bowed to the Khan and admitted that he was their overlord. The regent made his feelings plain by having all the ambassadors executed. It was Kublai's retaliation, an even larger fleet, that Marco Polo saw being assembled. Thanks to modern marine archaeology, we now understand the significance of his report of 15,000 ships on the river Yangtze, a great distance from the Korea Strait and a reflection of numerous botched and poorly organized planning decisions. Kublai's second fleet was packed with everything the Mongol warlords could scrape up, including condemned barges and creaking riverboats. The timbers were warped, even the nails had been shown to have a high sulfur content, suggesting that corners were cut in every possible stage of sourcing and construction. Overloaded with horses and supplies for a long campaign, packed so closely with men that 3,000 troops were dead from disease before land was even sighted, the Armada set sail in 2 task forces, one from Korea and the other up the coast from the mouth of the Yangtze. Fearful of being boxed in again at Hakata Bay, the Mongols dithered offshore, many of their unseaworthy vessels lashed together in a vast floating fortress. They were particularly wary of a seaborne attack, since many of their troops were timid Chinese and Korean conscripts, worried about reports of dragons in the water and all too ready to surrender. They had started out with 3 months' supplies, 2/3 of which they had already consumed, and they had still not made permanent landfall. Samurai boats came out to the Armada in 1s and 2s, numbers so small that the Mongols assumed they were there to offer terms. But the boats contained suicidal platoons on one-way missions. They cut down their own masts to make boarding ramps and stormed the larger warships. And then the real storm came, a second typhoon, even more powerful than the earlier one. Modern marine archaeologists, examining the smithereens on the seabed, estimate it to have been a Category 3 storm, a major hurricane with gusts of 199 kilometers per hour, 123.5 miles per hour, that whipped up waves into storm surges of up to 4 meters, 13 feet. Equivalent modern storms have been seen to strip the roofs off buildings, blow away mobile homes and uproot trees. For the close-packed boats of the Mongol Armada, it was a veritable apocalypse. Some 30,000 men managed to make it ashore from the sinking boats, bedraggled, starving, and without fresh water. They were easy pickings for the samurai defenders. The Mongols had every intention of coming back for a rematch, but they never did. An office within Kublai's administration was supposedly tasked with putting together a 3rd armada, but it was underfunded and overlooked and largely powerless after 1286. Kublai died in 1294, and his descendants more or less ignored the indomitable islands in the east. The great storms gained their own legendary status among the natives. Before long, certain religious cults were claiming that the no-show by a 3rd armada was the result of their intensive prayers. The Mongols, it was now claimed, had been fought off not merely by the warrior elite, but by the combined efforts of the entire nation, and even by the very elements themselves. In sending the weather to deliver the death blow, the gods had sent a divine wind, or Kamikaze. Their country, the locals believed, was special. It was unique. It was blessed by its particular gods and would never know defeat. For decades afterwards, guards on the shores watched the seas for a new attack, but none came. Meanwhile, the defense took its toll in a different, mundane way. It was not merely the loss of life, it was the colossal expense of the project which bankrupted many local lords. When in earlier times the samurai had been fighting one another, there was always a loser whose lands could be confiscated as the spoils of victory. But when the enemy came from another country, they left nothing behind but their dead. There was no reward that could be bestowed. Within a generation, the Kamakura shogunate's hold on power had collapsed, and the samurai had turned upon each other in another civil war, this time in the name of 2 rival emperors. As for Marco Polo's Cipangu, word of it was carried back to Europe. His tall tales of great riches and fierce knights would enter popular parlance. 2 centuries later, Christopher Columbus would set out in search of the Spice Islands and this legendary Cipangu, sailing west in the hope of reaching the east and finding something entirely unexpected. Today, we know more about the land that would be called Cipangu, Cipangu, Sipang, Japon, and then Japan in the languages of the West. But even in a modern, interconnected world, this name often seems at one remove. Nippon was the local people's own word for their archipelago, deliberately coined to imply that Japan was the land of the rising sun. Today, with the additional illusions offered by modern time zones, it is often regarded as a land a few steps into our own future, or a grim vestige of a warlike past. This is its story. Chapter 1. The Way of the Gods. Prehistoric and Mythical Japan. The old women said that the sea used to be lower. There were bays and inlets that had once been flat ground but were now steeped in salt water. It was getting harder to find deer. There used to be all sorts on the wide plains. The old women said that they were good meat. The old women had plenty of stories like this, but the young only knew what they could see themselves. The men hadn't caught a deer for months, but there was always food. Down by the shore you could pull shellfish from the shallows. One day one of the girls pulled up something else, a bone knife. The old women said that we, or people like us, had once lived there, but now the land was returned to the sea. The old women said that if the deer were gone, then we would soon follow. We should leave these long, thin islands and head north to the greater lands beyond the rising sun. Everybody knew they were there. You could see the clouds that formed above them. You could see the birds that returned there. Some of the fishermen, straying too far in their canoes, even claimed to have seen the lands themselves, lush and green with smoking mountains. Not all the old ones agreed. Most of the womenfolk did not mind the dwindling deer. Stick to the fish from the reef, they said. Save nuts and berries in jars against lean times. There were always shellfish to be pulled from the mud, and mud to make pots. Then there were ship people. They came from the direction of the setting sun. If we moved, they might not find us again. The ship people came to take our cowrie shells and traded them for magical wonders, hard tools that did not break, the pig creatures that ate anything and yielded succulent meat, the wondrous disk that reflected everything it saw, shining with the sun's light when turned upon it, revealing your true self when you stared into it. The old people argued about the future, and their children were dragged in like canoes at the edge of a whirlpool. All were agreed there were too many of us. The shoreline was getting crowded. You had to walk further into the shallows to find enough shellfish for dinner. It took longer and longer to find fruits from the forest. We should move on, onwards toward the rising sun, to the new lands that looked so green. No, some said, we should stay. Save more shells for the ship people, to trade for more of their pigs and their strange seeds. The arguments had been boiling for months, even years, but people were hungrier than they admitted, and that made them easier to anger. The wiser old women feared encounters with other tribes. What if there are already people in the green lands, they wondered. What then? But the menfolk were sure of themselves. We shall wield our mallet heads, they said. Wielding our stone mallets, we will crush them. Both sides thought they had won. The fishermen and their families got into their boats and headed to the north and east. They took any of the forest folk who wanted to go, but simply by leaving they were making it possible for others to stay. Tell the ship people, they said, tell them that we have gone toward the rising sun, where the lands are so plentiful that we will live forever. Tell them that, if any of you survive the next winter. Japan was born 15 million years ago, pushed away from the edge of Eurasia by the formation of the Japan Sea. At the time it was quite flat, but it sits at the confluence of three massive tectonic plates, the Eurasian, the Pacific, and the Philippine, which mashed together to buckle and warp the land into towering mountains. These heights, young in geological terms, created steep watercourses and fast rivers that rushed down toward the sea, dragging sediment with them. Elsewhere, the tectonic plates were forced downward. Only a million years after Japan was first formed, its first volcanoes burst into life, peppering the landscape with its oldest craters. 2 million years ago, the northern part of the island of Honshu was ripped apart by huge eruptions, the scars of which still form circular lakes and ridges, some miles wide. The map of Japan remains dotted with suspiciously round lakes and islands, or curved bays that indicate the forgotten edge of ancient craters. Even in the era of human settlements, occasional disasters have depopulated entire regions. Parts of Japan have been settled for the first time on multiple occasions, the newcomers being unaware that the bones of earlier inhabitants lay beneath their feet under layers of ash and mud. Even today, 1/10 of the world's active volcanoes can be found in Japan. Throughout its history, the nation's geographical situation has led to periodic disaster, not merely volcanic eruptions, but landslides caused by the precarious purchase of soil on its steep mountains and earthquakes from the continued push and shove of underground forces. From Japan's times of legend through to the modern era, there are tales of entire mountains falling into the sea, of new islands born from a flaming abyss, of the ground tearing itself apart only to invite great, overwhelming inrushes of the sea. It is no coincidence that tsunami is a Japanese word. Once every 800 to 1,100 years, for example, the sediments of North Japan show the evidence of a tsunamigenic deposit, a thick layer of mud left behind by an immense flood from the sea caused by an offshore earthquake in a fault line to be found 70 kilometers, 43.5 miles away on the seabed. court chronicles in 869 CE reported an earthquake and an onrushing tidal wave that killed 1,000 people and wiped out the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?